Part 1, Chapter 6b of The Adventures of Jimmie Dale. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please go to librivox.org. The Adventures of Jimmie Dale by Frank L. Packard. Reading by Julia Albert. Part 1, The Man in the Case. Chapter 6b, Devil's Work, continued. From the Blue Dragon to Chang Fu's was not far, and Jimmie Dale covered the distance in well under 5 minutes. Chang Fu's was just a tea merchant's shop, innocuous and innocent enough in its appearance, blatantly so indeed, and that was all, outwardly. But Jimmie Dale, as he reached his destination, experienced the first sensation of uplift he had known that night, and this from what, apparently, did not in the least seem like a contributing cause. "Luck! The blessed luck of it," he muttered grimly, as he surveyed the sightseeing car drawn up at the curb and watched the passengers crowding out of it to the ground. It wouldn't have been as easy to fool old Chang as it was that fellow back at the Dragon. And, besides, if I can work it, there's a better chance this way of getting out alive. The guide was marshalling his gapers, some 24 in all, men and women. Jimmie Dale unostentatiously fell in at the rear, and, the guide leading, the little crowd passed into the tea merchant's shop. Chang Fu, a wizened, wrinkled-faced little celestial, oily, suave, greeted them with profuse bows, chattering the while volubly in Chinese. The guide made the introduction with an all-embracing sweep of his hand. "Chang Fu, ladies and gentlemen," he announced, then held up his hand for silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said impressively, "this is one of the most notorious, if not THE most notorious dive in Chinatown, and it is only through special arrangement with the authorities and at great expense that the company is able exclusively to gain an entry here for its patrons. You will see here the real life of the Chinese, and in half an hour you will get what few would get in a lifetime spent in China itself. You will see the Chinese children dance and perform, the Chinese women at their household tasks, the Joss, the shrine of his hallowed ancestors, at which Chang Fu here worships, and you will enter the most famous opium den in the United States. Now, if you will all keep close together, we will make a start." In spite of his desperate situation, Jimmie Dale smiled a little whimsically. Yes, they would see it all, upstairs. The same old bunk dish out night after night at so much a head, and the nervous little schoolma'am of uncertain age who fidgeted now beside him would go back somewhere down in Maine and shiver while she related her wider experiences in tremulous whispers into the shocked ears of envious other maiden ladies of equally uncertain age. The same old bunk, and a profitable one for Chang Fu for more reasons than one. It was dust in the eyes of the police. The police smiled knowingly at mention of Chang Fu. Who should know, if they didn't, that it was all harmless fake, all bunk? And so it was, upstairs. They were passing out of the shop now, bowed out through a side door by the obsequious and oily Chang Fu, and now they massed again in a sort of little hallway, and Chang Fu, closing the door upon Jimmie Dale, who was the last in the line, shuffled back behind the counter in his shop to resume his guard duty over customers of quite another ilk. With the door closed, it was dark, pitch dark. And this, too, like everything else connected with Chang Fu's establishment, for more reasons than one, for effect and for security. Nervous little twitters began to emanate from the women. The guide's voice rose reassuringly. "Keep close together, ladies and gentlemen. We're going upstairs now to—" Jimmie Dale hugged back against the wall, sidled along it, and like a shadow slipped down to the end of the hall. The scuffling of 24 pairs of feet mounting the creaky staircase drowned the slight sound as he cautiously opened a door. The darkness lay back, impenetrable, along the hall, and then, as cautiously as he had opened it, he closed the door behind him, and stood for an instant listening at the head of a ladder-like stairway, his automatic in his hand now. It was familiar ground to Larry the Bat. The steps led down to a cellar, and diagonally across from the foot of the steps was an opening, ingeniously hidden by a heterogeneous collection of odds and ends, boxes, cases, and rubbish from the pseudo-tea shop above. A low opening in the wall to a passage that led on through the cellars of perhaps half a dozen adjoining houses, each of which latter was leased, in one name or another, by Chang Foo. Jimmie Dale crept down the steps, and in another moment had gained the farther side of the cellar. Then, skirting around the ruck of cases, he stooped suddenly and passed in through the opening in the wall. And now he halted once more. He was straining his eyes down a long, narrow passage, whose blackness was accentuated rather than relieved by curious wavering, gossamer threads of yellow light that showed here and there from under makeshift thresholds, from doors slightly ajar. Faint noises came to him, a muffled, intermittent clink of coin, a low, continuous droning hum of voices. The sickly sweet smell of opium pricked at his nostrils. Jimmie Dale's face set rigidly. It was the resort not only of the most depraved Chinese element, but of the worst white thugs that made New York their headquarters. Here, in the succession of cellars, roughly partitioned off to make a dozen rooms on either side of the passage, dope fiends sucked at the drug, and Chinese gamblers spent the greater part of their lives. Here, murder was hatched and played too often to its hellish end. Here, the scum of the underworld sought refuge from the police to the profit of Chang Foo, and here, somewhere, in one of these rooms, was the Wowzer. The Wowzer. Jimmie Dale stole forward silently, without a sound, swiftly, pausing only to listen for a second's space at the doors as he passed. From this one came that clink of coin, from another that jabber of Chinese, from still another that overpowering stench of opium, and once, iron-nerved as he was, a cold thrill passed over him. Let this lair of hell's wolves, so intent now on their own affairs, be once aroused, as they certainly must be roused before he could hope to finish the Wowzer, and his chance of escape were. He straightened suddenly, alert, tense, strained. Voices, raised in a furious quarrel, came from a door just behind him on the other side of the passage, where a film of light streamed out through a cracked panel. It was the Wowzer and Dago Jim. And drunk, both of them, and both in a blind fury. It happened quick then, almost instantaneously it seemed to Jimmie Dale. He was crouched now close against the door, his eye to the crack in the panel. There was only one figure in sight, Dago Jim, standing beside a table on which burned a lamp, the tabletop littered with watches, purses, and small chatelaine bags. The man was lurching unsteadily on his feet, a vicious sneer of triumph on his face, waving tauntingly an open letter and Jimmie Dale's pocketbook in his hands, waving them presumably in the face of the Wowzer, whom, from the restrictions of the crack, Jimmie Dale could not see. He was conscious of a sickening sense of disaster. His hope against hope had been In vain. The letter had been opened and read. The identity of the Gray Seal was solved. Dago Jim's voice roared out, hoarse, blasphemous, in drunken rage. "The Gray Seal, see? You spit your life, I knows. I been waitin' for something like this, damn youse. You's been stallin' on me for a year every time it came to a divvy. You've got a pocketful now, you snitch tonight, that youse are tryin' to do me out of. Well, keep 'em." He shoved his face forward. "I keep this, see? Keep 'em, Wowzer, you cross-eyed." "Everything I pinched tonight's on the table there with what youse pinched yourself," cut in the Wowzer, in a sullen, threatening growl. "Youse lie and youse know it," retorted Dago Jim. "Youse have given me the short end every time we've pulled a deal." "That letter's mine, youse," bawled the Wowzer furiously. "Why didn't youse open it and read it, then, instead of lettin' me do it to keep me busy while youse shortchanged me?" sneered Dago Jim. "Youse thought it was some sweet billy do, eh? Well, thanks, Wowzers, that's what it is. Say," he mocked, "there's a guy'll cash 1,000 century notes for this, and, if he don't say there's some reward out for the Gray Seal, wouldn't youse like to know who it is? Well, when I'm ridin' in me private buzz wagon, Wowzer, you'll stick around and maybe I'll tell youse, and maybe I won't." "By God!" the Wowzer's voice rose in a scream. "Youse hand over that letter! Youse go to—" Red, lurid red, a stream of flame seemed to cut across Jimmie Dale's line of vision, came the roar of a revolver shot, and, like a madman, Jimmie Dale flung his body at the door. Rickety at best, it crashed inward, half wrenched from its hinges, precipitating him inside. He recovered himself and leaped forward. The room was swirling with blue eddies of smoke. Dago Jim, hands flung up, still grasping the letter and pocketbook, pawed at the air and plunged with a sagging lurch face downward to the floor. There was a yell and an oath from the Wowzer, the crack of another revolver shot, the hum of the bullet past Jimmie Dale's ear, the scorch of the tongue flame in his face, and he was upon the other. Screeching profanity, the Wowzer grappled, and, for an instant, the two men rocked, reeled, and swayed in each other's embrace. Then, both men losing their balance, they shot suddenly backward, the Wowzer, undermost, striking his head against the table's edge, and men, table, and lamp crashed downward in a heap to the floor. It had been no more, at most, than a matter of seconds since Jimmie Dale had hurled himself into the room, and now, with a gurgling sigh, the Wowzer's arm, that had been wound around Jimmie Dale's back and shoulders, relaxed, and from the blow on his head the man lay back inert and stunned. And then it seemed to Jimmie Dale as though pandemonium and reality in chaos at the touch of some devil's hand reigned around him. It was dark. No, not dark. A spurt of flame was leaping along the line of trickling oil from the broken lamp on the floor. It threw into ghastly relief the sprawled form of Dago Jim. Outside, from along the passageway, came a confused jangle of commotion, whispering voices, shuffling feet, the swish of Chinese garments, and the room itself began to spring into weird, flickering shadows that mounted and crept up the walls with the spreading fire. There was not a second to lose before the room would be swarming with that rush from the passageway, and there was still the letter, the pocketbook. The table had fallen half over Dago Jim. Jimmie Dale pushed it aside, tore the crushed letter and the pocketbook from the man's hand, and felt, with a grim, horrible sort of anxiety, for the other's heartbeat, for the verdict that meant life or death to himself. There was no sign of life. The man was dead. Jimmie Dale was on his feet now. A face, another and another, showed in the doorway. The Wowzer was regaining his senses, stumbling to his knees. There was one chance, just one, to take those crowding figures by surprise, and with a yell of "Fire!" Jimmie Dale sprang for the doorway. They gave way before his rush, tumbling back in their surprise against the opposite wall, and, turning, Jimmie Dale raced down the passageway. Doors were opening everywhere now. Forms were pushing out into the semi-darkness, only to duck hastily back again as Jimmie Dale's automatic barked and spat a running fire of warning ahead of him, and then, behind, the Wowzer's voice shrieked out: "Soak him! Kill the guy! He's croaked Dago Jim! Put a hole in him! The—" Yells, a chorus of them, took up the refrain, then the rush of following feet, and the passageway seemed to racket as though a Gatling gun were in play with the fusillade of revolver shots. But Jimmie Dale was at the opening now, and, like a base runner plunging for the bag, he flung himself in a low dive through and into the open cellar beyond. He was on his feet, over the boxes, and dashing up the stairs in a second. The door above opened as he reached the top. Jimmie Dale's right hand shot out with a clubbed revolver, and with a grunt Chang Fu went down before the blow and the headlong rush. The next instant Jimmie Dale had sprung through the tea shop and was out on the street. A minute, 2 minutes more, and Chinatown would be in an uproar. Chang Fu would see to that, and the Wowzer would prod him on. The danger was far from over yet. And then, as he ran, Jimmie Dale gave a little gasp of relief. Just ahead, drawn up at the curb, stood a taxicab, waiting, probably for a private slumming party. Jimmie Dale put on a spurt, reached it, and wrenched the door open. "Quick!" he flung at the startled chauffeur. "The nearest subway station. There's a 10 spot in it for you. Quick, man! Quick! Here they come!" A crowd of Chinese, pouring like angry hornets from Chang Fu's shop, came yelling down the street, and the taxi took the corner on 2 wheels, and Jimmie Dale, panting, choking for his breath like a man spent, sank back against the cushions. But 5 minutes later it was quite another Jimmie Dale, composed, nonchalant, imperturbable, who entered an uptown subway train, and, choosing a seat alone near the center of the car, which at that hour of night in the downtown district was almost deserted, took the crushed letter from his pocket. For a moment he made no attempt to read it. His dark eyes, now that he was free from observation, full of troubled retrospect, fixed on the window at his side. It was not a pleasant thought that it had cost a man his life, nor yet that that life was also the price of his own freedom. True, if there were 2 men in the city of New York whose crimes merited neither sympathy nor mercy, those 2 men were the Wowzer and Dago Jim. But yet, after all, it was a human life, and, even if his own had been in the balance, thank God it had been through no act of his that Dago Jim had gone out. The Wowzer, cute and cunning, had been quick enough to say so to clear himself, but Jimmie Dale smiled a little now. Neither the Wowzer, nor Chang Fu, nor Chinatown would ever be in a position to recognize their uninvited guest. Jimmie Dale's eyes shifted to the letter speculatively, gravely. It seemed as though the night had already held a year of happenings, and the night was not over yet. There was the letter. It had already cost 1 life. Was it to cast another, or what? It began as it always did. He read it through once, in amazement, a second time, with a flush of bitter anger creeping to his cheeks, and a third time, curiously memorizing, as it were, snatches of it here and there. Dear philanthropic crook. Robbery of Hudson Mercantile National Bank. Trusted employee is ex-convict. Bad police record. Served term in Sing Sing 3 years ago. Known to police as Bookkeeper Bob. Real name is Robert Moyne. Lives at Street, Harlem. Inspector Burton and Lanigan of headquarters trailing him now. Robbery not yet made public. There was a great deal more. 4 sheets of closely written data. With an exclamation almost of dismay, Jimmie Dale pulled out his watch. So that was what Burton and Lanigan were up to. And he had actually ran into them. Lord, the irony of it. And then Jimmie Dale stared at the dial of his watch incredulously. It was still but barely midnight. It seemed impossible that since leaving the theatre at a few minutes before 11, he had lived through but a single hour. Jimmie Dale's fingers began to pluck at the letter, tearing it into pieces, tearing the pieces over and over again into tiny shreds. The train stopped at station after station. People got on and off. Jimmie Dale's hat was over his eyes, and his eyes were glued again to the window. Had Bookkeeper Bob returned to his flat in Harlem with the detectives at his heels? Or were Burton and Lanigan still trailing the man downtown, somewhere around the cafes? If the former, the theft of the letter and its incident loss of time, had been an irreparable disaster. If the latter, well, who knew? The risk was the Gray Seals. At 125th Street, Jimmie Dale left the train, and, at the end of a sharp 4 minutes' walk, during which he had dodged in and out from street to street, stopped on a corner to survey the block ahead of him. It was a block devoted exclusively to flats and apartment houses, and, apart from a few belated pedestrians, was deserted. Jimmie Dale strolled leisurely down one side, crossed the street at the end of the block, and strolled leisurely back on the other side. There was no sign of either Burton or Lanigan. It was a fairly safe presumption, then, that Bookkeeper Bob had not returned yet, or one of the detectives at least would have been shadowing the house. Jimmie Dale, smiling a little grimly, retraced his steps again, and turned deliberately into a doorway, whose number he had noted as he had passed a moment or so before. So, after all, there was time yet. This was the house. Number 18, she had said in her letter. A flat, 3 stories. Moyne lives on the ground floor. Jimmie Dale leaned against the vestibule door. There was a faint click. A little steel instrument was withdrawn from the lock, and Jimmie Dale stepped into the hall, where a gas jet, turned down, burned dimly. The door of the ground floor apartment was at his right. Jimmie Dale reached up and turned off the light. Again those slim, tapering, wonderfully sensitive fingers worked with the little steel instrument, this time in the lock of the apartment door. Again there was that almost inaudible click, and then cautiously, inch by inch, the door opened under his hand. He peered inside, down a hallway lighted, if it could be called lighted at all, by a subdued glow from 2 open doors that gave upon it, peered intently, listening intently, as he drew a black silk mask from his pocket and slipped it over his face. And then, silent as a shadow in his movements, the door left just ajar behind him, he stole down the carpeted hallway. Opposite the first of the open doorways, Jimmie Dale paused. a curiously hard expression creeping over his face, his lips beginning to droop ominously downward at the corners. It was a little sitting room, cheaply but tastefully furnished, and a young woman, bookkeeper's Bob's wife evidently, and evidently sitting up for her husband, had fallen sound asleep in a chair, her head pillowed on her arms that were outstretched across the table. For a moment Jimmie Dale held there, his eyes on the scene, and the next moment, his hand curved into a clenched fist, he had passed on and entered the adjoining room. It was a child's bedroom. A night lamp burned on a table beside the bed, and the soft rays seemed to play and linger and caress on the tousled golden hair of a little girl of perhaps 2 years of age. And something seemed to choke suddenly in Jimmie Dale's throat. The sweet, innocent little face, upturned to his, was smiling at him as she slept. Jimmie Dale turned away his head, his eyelashes wet under his mask. Beneath the mattress of the child's bed, the letter had said. His face like stone, his lips a thin line now, Jimmie Dale's hand reached deftly in without disturbing the child and took out a package, and then another. He straightened up, a bundle of crisp new $100 notes in each hand, and on the top of one, slipped under the elastic band that held the bills together, an unsealed envelope. He drew out the latter and opened it. It was a second-class steamship passage to Vera Cruz, made out in a fictitious name, of course, to John Davies, the booking for next day's sailing. From the ticket, from the stolen money, Jimmie Dale's eyes lifted to rest again on the little golden head, the smiling lips, and then, dropping the packages into his pockets, his own lips moved queerly, he turned abruptly to the door. "My God, the shame of it!" he whispered to himself. He crept down the corridor, past the open door of the room where the young woman still sat fast asleep, and, his mask in his pocket again, stepped softly into the vestibule, and from there to the street. Jimmie Dale hurried now, spurred on it seemed by a hot, insensate fury that raged within him. There was still one other call to make that night, still those remaining and minute details in the latter part of her letter, grim and ugly in their portent. End of Part 1, Chapter 6b.